there's an Indian narrative, of course, and in the Indian narrative, it has been memorialized as India's win over Pakistan. I think it's like been referred to as India's finest win.
When we talk about 1971 in Pakistan, the narrative usually it begins with the Indian intervention and the Bengali separatism.
Violence does not happen overnight. Genocides don't happen overnight. There's a certain making of it. We see that in India when it comes to Kashmir, how easily Kashmiris are labeled as Pakistan-sponsored terrorists.
One of the most important aspects of your research is that you also engage with the experiences of Biharis and the Urdu-speaking communities, whose stories are usually absent from the dominant narratives that we read in textbooks about the 1971.
It's a big learning for me. Communities are not monolithic, they're not homogenous, they're not just these solid blocks.
The last 15 to 20 or approximately 20 years rule of Sheikh Hasina also produced a very close relationship between Bangladesh and India. Hello and welcome to another episode. Today we have with us Anam Zakaria. She is an award-winning author, Pakistani author, and an oral historian whose work explores conflict, memory, and human stories that are often neglected in the official narratives. She is the author of 1971, A Journey, A People's History from Pakistan, Bangladesh, and India. Her second book is Between the Great Divide, A Journey into Pakistan's Administered Kashmir. And the third book, that has won the award as well, The Footprints of Partition. Her work gives us an opportunity to look at some of the most contested chapters of South Asian history through the voices of people who have lived them. Thank you so much, ma'am, for joining. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. Thanks, Raesa, and thank you, Naya, Daur.
Thank you.
Great to be here.
So today we will mainly discuss the 1971 in reference to your book. And in that regard, my first question to you is that when we talk about 1971 in Pakistan, the narrative usually it begins with the Indian intervention and the Bengali separatism. But facts in textbooks tell us that Bengalis had genuine political, economic, linguistic, and democratic grievances long before India intervened. What did you hear from ordinary Bengalis that helped you understand the depth of those grievances?
Thank you for that question. I think I started writing this book because I realized somewhere along the way of doing my oral history work, I began with working on the 1947 partition. And while I was doing that, I began to realize there was so much I did not know. There were so many silences in our history, in Pakistani history, when it comes to 1971. And it almost feels like, 71, the war just happens. And we don't really talk about it. We don't talk about it in our textbooks. And I won't say there's a blanket silencing because it's too recent a history. And I think that's important because sometimes, people will say, no, but we do talk about 71. I realize that the way in which we talk about 1971 is very limiting. So we have certain parameters of what we talk about, and that also kind of determines what we don't talk about. And because of that, it seems to emerge out of nowhere, right? And then it gets labeled as this kind of Indian enemy conspiracy, and we kind of push it behind us. But when I went to Bangladesh and I spent time kind of listening to people's stories and really understanding their memory of it, and almost everybody I met had some relationship to 71. Either they had lost somebody or they had lived through it themselves. I think it was very interesting to note that things don't happen overnight, right? Violence does not happen overnight. Genocides don't happen overnight. There's a certain making of it. And for people, right, these are people, this was a region that supported the Pakistan movement very significantly, right? Was the birthplace of the Muslim League. So then what happens really between 1947 and 71? What are those unique points at which people get disillusioned? Right? When they feel like their grievances are not being heard. So I heard all kinds of things, of course, around economic grievances, right? Social grievances, political grievances, around the 1965 war, how there was really no defense of East Pakistan, about natural disasters and not really having support, but also about language. And language is not just it's not just what we speak in, right? Language is a symbol of much more. Language is a symbol of culture, right? So when you put down a language, you're putting down an entire culture, right? So you kind of hear that slow, gradual dehumanization of an ethnic population, right? And a marginalization, right? So what a lot of Bengalis said to me was that we felt like colonization did not really end. It just kind of changed its shape. And so it's these unique points in history, and it varied for people, which was also very interesting to see, because there were those who were in the older generation who really supported the Pakistan movement. For some of them, it wasn't really until 1971, in my interviews, right, until March 1971, when the military operation happens, that they kind of give up, in a sense, on this idea of Pakistan, right? For others, it was much earlier. For students who were kind of engaged in political activity, so there are these unique markers in which people kind of begin to question, begin to get demoralized, disillusioned, and it happens in many cases before 1971 itself, and it leads to what we see in 1971.
Okay, but there is an other extension to the same question, that despite those grievances being real, were Bengalis? Why were Bengalis so often portrayed as Indian agents rather than as citizens with legitimate political demands in West Pakistan?
Yeah, I think that we have to understand through it's a framework, right? And it's a framework that's been used again and again for different ethnic communities, basically people asking for their rights. Right? And it is not a problem that is also unique to Pakistan. We see that, right? We see that in India when it comes to Kashmir, how easily Kashmiris are labeled as Pakistan sponsored terrorists. We see that in Palestine. We see that with how Israel, kind of uses the label of terrorism and enemy infiltration, right? And sponsoring as a way. So it's a framework to delegitimate rights-based movements, right? It's not something that only happened in 71. It did not end there, unfortunately. So we continue seeing that. So it's the easiest way to deflect, essentially, instead of taking responsibility when people question their rights and maybe there's a challenge to the status quo and to the power and the hegemony, right? It is a very effective, unfortunately, way of delegitimating it and saying, well, these are really enemies, right? When people actually, as citizens, have a right to ask for those demands, and when they're asking for those demands, they're actually, in a way, strengthening citizenship and nation making in that process, but we don't see it like that. So it's an old framework which unfortunately is deployed by different countries, and it continues to be deployed in Pakistan. That's what we saw in 71, and it became they chose these markers which became very easy, right? So women wear saris or tikas, or they listen to this kind of music, or Bengali language is derived from Sanskrit, and so you can find these symbols which you can otherize, and that's kind of what we saw, and that kind of cultural oppression, alongside the social, political, economic oppression, really marginalized Bengalis, and again kind of led to 71, which didn't happen overnight.
Very well said. Another important point in my mind while I was reading the book as well was that one of the most important aspects of your research is that you also engage with the experiences of Biharis and the Urdu speaking communities, whose stories are usually absent from the dominant narratives that we read in textbooks about the 1971. When you spoke to Biharis, what did they tell you about their relationship with Pakistan? Did they see Pakistan as their homeland? And how did the events of 1971 change that relationship? You can also share some anecdote.
Yeah, yeah. Those are difficult. I mean, all the interviews I conducted, they were incredibly, incredibly difficult. These were the interviews I conducted with the Urdu-speaking community, especially in Bangladesh, because I also did some with the community in Karachi that have kind of now moved and relocated and settled in Karachi. But the ones in Bangladesh were very difficult. They are, of course, after 2008, things have changed, policies have changed. Officially, you're not stateless anymore, but there are many kind of challenges that people continue to grapple with when it comes to bureaucracy and paperwork and all of those pieces. So I went to the Geneva camp, and many people continue to live there, and it was. I did not go as a Pakistani representative at all. I'm an oral historian, an independent researcher, right? But people had walked for days and days and days and days and days to come and meet me, right? Because they wanted they wanted to be heard by a Pakistani, and for me to kind of take these narratives back to say, we kept waiting, right, and we were never acknowledged. And the really disheartening thing about this is that I know you're saying that we don't really kind of hear about the Urdu speaking community in our textbooks. I think there is a narrative around the Urdu speaking community and the violence that they kind of experienced. Unfortunately, that violence is too often weaponized. So it's not from a lens of justice, because if it was from a lens of justice, there would be a question of like, well, there's so many who continue to kind of hope that Pakistan would own them, and we would look at it from that lens, right? And we would have that conversation. But instead, that violence is kind of weaponized to justify then violence against Bengalis. So again, it is done within these certain parameters, and for people, their life is not. It cannot be reduced to that politics, right? It's an everyday reality of what they're dealing with. So those were really difficult. They're difficult experiences, difficult stories to capture. But what you also see is communities. This was very interesting for me, and it was a big learning for me. Communities are not monolithic, they're not homogenous, they're not just these solid blocks, right? And things change over time. So what you now have, what I noticed in some of the interviews, at least, and my work is limited, so I don't make any generalizations, but in the interviews that I conducted, you notice intergenerational differences, because now you have people from the Urdu speaking community who were born and brought up in Bangladesh, and in many ways were marginalized and not owned and kind of seen as collaborators, right? And they've had to live with that label as well. And so a lot of them kind of say, no, we are not looking towards Pakistan, we want to build a life over here. But then you also have people in the older generation who kind of are still waiting. So you see these different politics emerge. Sometimes, even fault lines emerge within communities, because of what's happened after 71. I mean, it's we're talking 50 years later, right? So that changes. So depending on who you talk to, their relationship with Pakistan will really, really vary. And I spoke to some, even school students. And they look at it very differently, and in many ways they've had to look at it very differently. So there is a changing politics intergenerationally, but it is I think, it is deeply, I mean, I won't just say tragic, but it's a very uncomfortable, I think, history, that we have not at all even begun to come to terms with.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So we tend to remember 1971 through very clear national frameworks in our Pakistan studies books, and but Bangladesh remembers liberation, Pakistan remembers dismemberment and defeat, while India often remembers military and humanitarian victory. But what did you discover when you moved beyond these state narratives and listened to the ordinary people on the ground? What were some of the most uncomfortable or surprising truths for you?
I mean, I think at the heart of it, this book is very much about a Pakistani going to Bangladesh at a very particular point in time, and undoing some of the silences and the censorship that we encounter in Pakistan, right? So when I sit with Bengalis and I hear about the scale, and the intensity of violence that they experience, and these are stories that are missing from Pakistani narratives, right? So that in itself, I mean, I had some sense going in because I had done enough reading around it, and there was a reason why I wanted to write this book. So I knew that violence had happened, but it's something else to really go to those sites, to sit with families, to look at those intergenerational impacts, to look at how that trauma is still so embodied, right? For many of them, I was one of the first Pakistanis they were meeting, so it was very visceral. And I think very important as a Pakistani for me to be able to sit with, yes, deeply uncomfortable, deeply unsettling, deeply important to acknowledge, right? And so that violence in itself, which is completely erased from Pakistan, that was very important. But what I also came across, again in India, I'll talk briefly. I think it's really interesting that there's an Indian narrative, of course, and in the Indian narrative, it has been. memorialized as India's win over Pakistan. I think it's like been referred to as India's finest win. But of course, for Bengalis, there's a resentment towards this as well, because they feel like it was a people's movement, right? Yes, India supported, but it was a people's movement at the heart of it, and that kind of erases that. When you go and you do interviews, though, in Bengal in India, or you kind of look at stories in Assam, it's very different in the regions, where refugees also moved in, and where the borders are very, very close. It's a different kind of history, and it goes beyond those larger nationalistic state narratives. It's much more nuanced, and though that's where you find a lot of really moving human stories. I think the part that really surprised me were some stories in Pakistan, actually. So these were stories that I had not come across till that point in any book. These were stories of poets and intellectuals and even people from the military, right, who kind of opposed what happened in 1971, opposed the military operation, opposed the violence, the degree of violence, the way the violence happened. They wrote against it, they were jailed for it, they protested, they were spat on, right? They were censored in many ways, and they continued to do that work. And to be able to sit with people like that and to hear those stories, it's an undoing in some ways. It's deeply inspirational, and it also shows you that, of course, it was a very limited movement. It was a small movement, but it also shows you that even in the most oppressive times, there is often, resistance. And I think these resistance narratives were something I did not know about, and were just like really informed me, because you had people kind of, again, like people who served in the army, kind of really openly talking about what went deeply wrong, and talking about that violence. And hearing that, it shows you that state narratives, no matter how homogenous they try to be, right, there will always be some kind of punctuation in those, and you'll find that, if only you want to listen.
Yes. Okay, you make a very interesting claim about the selective memory, about that societies remember certain things while forgetting others, and that memories of trauma can overshadow everything else. Do you think that the memory of 1971 is itself beginning to fade or change, particularly among younger generations in Bangladesh? And when we see symbols associated with Sheikh Mujibur Rahman being attacked or removed or broken, and his historical role being questioned, does that suggest that Bangladeshis are genuinely rethinking Sheikh Mujibur Rahman's role in 1971, or is it just a reaction to contemporary politics?
I think it's an interesting question. I will say I was in Bangladesh in 2017. This was very much Sheikh Hasina's time, and it was a very different politics. And so I am not doing research there right now. So my opinion is in many ways like a layperson's opinion, my reading of the situation. So I will give that kind of disclaimer. I think that symbols take on meanings and newer meanings, right? So when you see symbols kind of being attacked, it's not so much 1971 and the memory of 1971, right? But it is the fact that over time, I mean, Bangladesh has had its own post liberation war kind of history and politics and appropriation. What's happening is that those symbols sometimes got so associated with Sheikh Hasina's regime that this is a response to that, right? I don't think 70, I think 71 is very defining, right? And of course, other things will happen and memory will change, because memory is malleable and it shifts over time. But to say that 71 is fading, I would not think that's happening right now, because I think 71 is a very real history. It's a very personal history. Like I said, almost everybody I met had a personal relationship to it. This was not something abstract that they're referring to, right? This is very much a personal history. So when you see symbols being attacked, it's because those symbols over time took certain meaning, right? So Sheikh Mujib got associated with Sheikh Hasina's politics, and you might see a reaction to that. You might kind of see a response to her regime happening. But I don't. Is that an attack on the memory of 71 or even Mujib's role? I don't know. I don't know. Is there a desire to have a more nuanced understanding? Is there a desire to have to be able to go back and because a lot of Bangladeshis have talked about, the limitations on research and all of those pieces. Is there desire for that? Absolutely, absolutely. But I wouldn't. I don't think it's as simplistic as just in a sense moving on. It's genocidal violence, and I think that will continue to be defining.
Okay,
Yeah.
and this leads me to another question, that the last 15 to 20 or approximately 20 years rule of, rule of Sheikh Hasina also produced a very close relationship between Bangladesh and India, while Hasina herself spent time in India after being ousted. Given that history, do you think the recent political developments have prompted some Bangladeshis to reassess India's role in their history? And more broadly, do you think that Bangladeshis are beginning to rethink their long-standing hostility towards Pakistan in comparison to India?
Once somebody I interviewed in Bangladesh said this to me. He said, history in Bangladesh has been like a football, right? Depending on who's in power, you keep kind of tossing it, right? And so I remember when I was going and I was speaking with somebody, and he was a former military official, and I said, I'm going to Bangladesh to do these interviews, and he said, Khalda bhabi ko mera salam dena, and I was really for a second taken aback. I didn't know what he meant, and then I realized he's referring to BNP. So we've had this, in many ways, it's been this kind of like proxy. It's depending on who's in power. Relationships have been closer to Pakistan, or relationships have been closer to India. And of course, Sheikh Hasina was in power for a very long time. And so it was, in a very simplistic way, kind of seen as a pro India, anti Pakistan politics. And you might be kind of seeing that shift right now. I think if you're talking about state level, that might be happening. If you're talking about people's level, I think even when I was there, there was this kind of resentment as this Indian kind of hegemony in the region, this big brother kind of attitude, and people's opinions are far more nuanced than states. And some would support Pakistani cricket, for example, and there are those things. But I also, again, I don't think it's as simple. And I think Pakistani should not get overly excited about this. Really, because the state level politics are shifting does not mean that the trauma, the wounding, the violence, and the act of violence, which is the denial of that violence, I really see that as another act of violence. One is you enact violence on bodies, you inscribe violence on bodies, and then you deny that that violence happened, which is another form of violence. We are not there. That kind of acknowledgement has not happened. I know we're getting more comfortable talking about 71 today in Pakistan, which is really, really wonderful. Has there been a deep understanding and acknowledgement of the policies, the systems, the systemic challenges, the systemic violence, which continues to operate in other ways in Pakistan? Have we done a true kind of reckoning of that? No, I don't think so. So yes, you might see states kind of lean more in more friendly ways towards India or Pakistan at different times, but much deeper work is needed if we really want healing, and we really, really want to kind of repair in any way possible now, 50 years later. So yeah, I would maybe I'll say that. Yeah.
Okay. Also, you have previously spoken about the controversy surrounding the use of the term genocide. I was listening to one of your interviews. In that, also, you mentioned about this, that matlab, the usage of term of genocide in relation to 1971 in Bangladesh, genocide is central to the national memory of the war, while in Pakistan there has historically been considered resistance to that terminology, with greater emphasis often placed on violence against non-Bengalis, including Biharis. After speaking to people on different sides of the history, how do you understand this debate?
I understand that what happens in one country informs the other. That's what I understand. So I think Bangladesh's insistence on really recognizing this as genocide, right, and numbers becoming very sacred. I really do see it in response to Pakistan's denial. Right? If there was not this kind of denial, you might see a different kind of politics emerge. And we were talking a little while earlier about symbols and all of that. I mean, Sheikh Hasina's politics were in many ways is shaped by Pakistan's politics as well, or lack thereof around 1971. So these things are, they're dynamic, and they feed into each other and they influence each other. When it comes to genocide, there's a reason why the term was coined, right? It's supposed to convey a seriousness of crime, a particular type of crime, and it has meaning. right? And we have not recognized the genocidal violence that happened. And instead, it's not even just we're saying we don't recognize that genocide happened, we use that term to come up with our own genocide, right? So because it is used and last I went to the army museum in Lahore, it is very much used. It's called the genocide of pro-Pakistanis. And I think that is very disturbing because you're taking a term that you refuse to acknowledge, but then you turn it on its head and you say, no, the real violence is this kind of tit for tat. Where's the real violence, right? And in that, you're using people's bodies and people's stories to really weaponize them, right? To say, to delegitimate, essentially, and to nullify, to neutralize, and then to say, well, violence happens on both sides, but this is the real violence. I think that is deeply problematic. And I think Bangladesh's demand for this to be acknowledged needs to be taken very, very seriously. There's kind of no going back. Like I said, the denial of violence is an act of violence for me. So it needs to be acknowledged. And I think terminology can be important. I mean, why do we need to refer to what's happening in Palestine as genocide? There's a reason for that, right? And we might also push for that, but we have difficulty doing that when it comes to our own history.
Okay. So lastly, I would like to ask you that your book raises a much larger question, that how do three countries, India, Pakistan and Bangladesh, remember the same historical event so differently? What did your research teach you about how these three countries perceive each other? I know this is a broad question. You can be very brief about this. Just give us one major example.
Again, things change. So these things are very dynamic. But if I had to put it really, really very simply, in Pakistan, when I was doing this work, it's kind of framed as this loss, this sometimes even regret. So when we use terminologies like dismemberment or fall or sukuted haka, there's a sense of loss at the hands of India. It's kind of seen sometimes as a revenge that India took for partition. In Bangladesh, language around liberation and nation making, right? And in India, then kind of India and Pakistan both reducing it to an India Pakistan war. I mean, I grew up, and I don't know about you, but I really grew up referring to this as the third India Pakistan war. And I really thought that that's it. And when I was doing this book, I thought it would be very easy for me to go to Bangladesh and do this work. And it's, because the problem was with India. So I think that it gets kind of reduced to this hegemonic India-Pakistan battle, just one more of the many that we have fought. Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for sharing your impartial and unbiased analysis on 1971. We'll be there with you with another episode, but thank you so much for now.
Thank you for having me.